Would you be in prayer with me? Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts, our thoughts, be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our strength, our rock, our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Well, the calendar that the worldwide church follows says today we celebrate Christ the King Sunday. Christ the King Sunday. Now, to my knowledge, this might be the first time in many, many years that Christ the King Sunday has been celebrated here. And so it seemed appropriate to me to share a little bit about it, what it is, and some of the history behind it. Christ the King Sunday. It's celebrated on the first Sunday after Thanksgiving and the Sunday just prior to the season of Advent. That time when we remember and pray and prepare for the arrival of God on earth in the form of a child. Think about that. God on earth in the form of a child. Advent is that time of year we light a candle every Sunday as we celebrate the coming of Christ through music and scripture. The celebration of the declared feast of Christ the King was originally instituted in 1925 by Pope Pius XI, a declaration that was called Quas Primus, which means the first. So it was 92 years ago that the first feast of Christ the King Sunday was celebrated. Still today in the 21st century, Western Christians around here and around the world, actually, both Catholic and Protestant, continue to celebrate this feast on this day. At the time of its institution, secularism was on the rise, and many Christians doubted Christ's authority and even doubted Christ's existence at all. Now that year in 1925, it also saw the rise of dictatorships in Europe, and many Christians were swayed by the beliefs of these earthly leaders. The Christ the King celebration was instituted during a time when there was very, very little respect for Christians or for Christ. Pope Pius hoped that the annual celebration would move people toward accomplishing three things. See if you can relate to these three things. Number one, nations would see that the church has the right to freedom and immunity from the control of the state. The second thing, that leaders and nations would see that they're bound to give respect to Christ. They didn't have to believe, they didn't have to follow Christ, but that they were bound to give respect to Christ. And number three, that the faithful would gain strength and courage, that's us, would gain strength and courage from this celebration as they were reminded that Christ must reign in their hearts and their minds and their wills and their bodies. You may have noticed in those goals for this celebration that every single one of them is still very much needed today. These problems that we talk about have not diminished, and many of us might argue that these problems have worsened. I've been told that one of the reasons the celebration has been pushed to the back burner in our world today, that churches often don't recognize this Sunday, is that in some churches, king language isn't very popular. People don't like to hear about kings having authority over them, and so very few churches take the time to consider what the kingship of Christ might actually mean. But in this turbulent world of today, one that seems to bristle in any kind of authority, not just authority in the church, I think it's all the more important for us as Christians to proudly celebrate Christ the King Sunday, where the loving, merciful, and just King of the universe can be held high and praised, much as we did this morning. So this morning I'm asking this question. What kind of a king is this? What kind of a king is this? He doesn't wear a fighter hat. He doesn't wear a cowboy hat. He doesn't wear the kingly, worldly things of authority that we see. And so who is he? Is Christ a tyrannical king who forces obedience on his subjects? Is Christ a weak king? Many people believe that. Weak, unable to manage and rule his own kingdom? So to help us answer those questions, I invite you to consider this story. It was written by Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard as he tried to describe the incarnation. Now, who can verbally describe the incarnation, right? It's just nearly impossible. But as he tries to describe the decision God made to become flesh, as he tries to decide what is the reality of God in Christ. So here it is. We'll start with once upon a time. A certain king was very rich. His power was known throughout the world, but he was most unhappy, for he desired a wife. Without a queen, the vast palace was empty. So one day, while riding through the streets of a small village, he saw a beautiful peasant girl. So lovely was she that the heart of the king was instantly won. He wanted her more than anything he had ever desired. So on succeeding days, he would ride by her house with the mere hope of catching a glimpse of her. He wondered how he might win her love, and he thought, I know, I will draw up a royal decree and require her to be brought to me, and she can be the queen of my land. But as he considered it, he realized that she was a subject and would be forced to obey. And then he could never be certain that he had her love. Then he said to himself, I will call on her in person. I'll dress in my finest royal garb with my crown, my diamond rings, my silver sword at my side, my shiny black polished boots. I will overwhelm her and sweep her off her feet to become my bride. But as he pondered that idea, he knew that he would always wonder whether she had married him for his riches and the power that he could give to her rather than his true love. So then, he decided to dress as a peasant. He would just dress like the people that she lived around, and then he would drive to the town and have this carriage let him off on the outside of town. And then in disguise, he would approach her house. But that involved deception. And he decided that wasn't probably the best choice either. At last, he knew exactly what he had to do. He would shed his royal robes, send them away. He would leave his royal palace, never to return. He would go to the village, and he would become one of the peasants. He would work with them, live with them, suffer with them, celebrate with them. He would actually become a peasant. And this he did. And he won his wife. Kierkegaard goes on to say, and so, I believe, did God consider how he might win humankind. God in Christ became one of us. He took upon himself the form of a human being to dwell with us and in us. Paul in 2 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, says, God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself. It's more than my brain can capture. At the time of the crucifixion of Jesus, whenever the Roman soldiers would crucify a criminal, it was common for one of them to carry a sign that said what they were being accused of, what they were being condemned for. For Jesus, no actual crime had been determined. When he was on the way to the cross, no actual crime had been determined. So it's recorded that his official crime was in claiming to be the king of the Jews, even though he never ever directly made that claim. However, he did claim to be one with God. And it was because of that claim that the Jewish religious authorities pressed the Romans to move forward to crucify him. Jesus did speak of a kingdom. He did talk about a kingdom, but it was a kingdom not of this world. You see, the kingdom of Christ is not a kingdom of earthly treasures. It's not a kingdom of palaces and servants. Jesus said in Mark 10, you lack one thing. Go sell all that you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Come on. follow me. The kingdom of Christ is an upside-down kingdom where the first are last, and the king is the servant to his subjects. Speaking of himself, Jesus said, "For even the Son of Man cannot be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Imagine people hearing that this king wasn't there to rule, but to serve. Imagine those hearing that, trying to wrap their heads around what kind of a king it must be that lays his life down for his subjects. A king like that was absolutely unheard of. It was unimaginable then, and it's unimaginable yet today. And then in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18, it says, "At that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, 'Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?'" They needed that hierarchy. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And so Jesus called a child over to himself. And he put that child in the middle of them, and he said, "Truly I say to you, unless you go a different direction than you're going now, and become like children, you won't ever enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." We're told we need to be like children, honest, genuine, sincere, and never to lose our wonderment over creation, just like God. Just like God, who very much like a child has never, ever, ever stopped being wowed by his creation. God's never stopped being amazed at all that he has created. My granddaughter Lucy is coming up on 4 years old, and she has a growing vocabulary, and she's always asking what words mean, and always trying to put together a growing understanding, right, of the world around her. Some of you saw on Facebook when I told about her complete astonishment over eating meat that came from roast, a cow. She thought that was the craziest thing she'd ever heard. So when I brought home sand and seashells from our recent trip to Florida, I wondered if she would think that they were as wonderful as I thought they were, because, I thought they were the greatest thing ever. So I gave them to her in this large bowl, and I let her pour the white sand out of the container into the bowl, and I just saw her eyes light up. She went on to play and scoop and sift and let the sand run between her fingers for almost 30 minutes, and she never said a word the whole time. That was way more than I had hoped for in her reaction, and as I watched her experience these textures and these colors and these parts of the world that she had never imagined, I was drawn to that. I could feel the excitement and the wonder that she was feeling. There's just something beautiful and sincere about the simple heart of a child. And I'm convinced that reflected in the eyes of a child is the clearest image of God we will ever find on earth. Over the centuries, we've had some teachers, unfortunately, that have taught us that God is someone to be feared much more than loved. And I just can't buy into this truth. I don't believe we serve a God who is primarily concerned with judgment and judgment alone, but rather a God who laughs and plays and sees possibilities. It's difficult for me to imagine a God of judgment creating a heart of wonder in a child. It's hard for me to imagine a God of condemnation creating the wonder and mystery of our human expressions of hope and joy and love and peace. Now, I'm not saying that God doesn't ever judge, but I think that God's primary attribute really is love. And the most natural expression of his love was to create both objects and human beings that reflect that love. We're like mirrors that reflect his love to the world. I tend to see faith as more of a dance than a science. In Christ, we've been invited to participate in the love of our Creator. Religion alone is very dry, it's very boring. Theology alone is theory and sometimes just banter, right? When you get to talking theology with your friends. But experiencing the love of the King, that is understanding true faith. That experience that you can have, that is what is true love. So as we began today, I asked, what king is this? And I just got to tell you, it's King Jesus. He is King Jesus. And he announces and proclaims to us, he speaks to us the very heart of God. He shares it with us, and he hands it to us, and he demonstrates it to us. He reveals to us the one that created us. So as we enter this Advent season together, I invite you to join with me in celebrating so much more than just another stinking holiday season. Be free from that and look for the joy. Rather, let's let this festive season be more than just presents and food, although those are pretty stinking fabulous too. But I pray that this season, your hearts, our hearts together, might be drawn into a deep relationship with God as we celebrate that real gift of grace that we can find together in Jesus Christ. So just allow it to happen. Let your soul be drawn into a deep reverence of God as you celebrate the arrival, as you celebrate the coming of Christ, our King. May it always be so. Amen.